From a raw number perspective, we essentially saw a midterm level turnout in a special election the Tuesday after Thanksgiving.
The average swing here is 19 points to the left across 6 House special elections. This one saw the smallest swing to the left of any of them, but in some ways it may have been the most washed.
Everything is pointing in the same direction, and that direction is voters aren't happy with Republicans right now.
Suddenly, not every Republican candidate is running every ad saying, "Hey, I'm with Donald Trump," in a way that we haven't seen in recent times. Hey there, welcome to the Decision Desk HQ podcast. I'm your host, Jeffrey Skelly, Chief Elections Analyst here at DDHQ. It's officially Tennessee week in the political world. On Tuesday, a special election in Tennessee's 7th Congressional District drew the attention of election watchers everywhere. And while it's a seat that President Donald Trump carried by about 22 percentage points in 2024, 60% to 38%, the special election race between Republican Matt Van Epps and Democrat Afton Bain looked to be close coming into Tuesday's special election. In the end, Van Epps, the Republican, won 54% to 45% to keep the seat in Republican hands. However, that still represented a 13-point swing to the left in margin from the 2024 presidential election, even as the race had fairly high turnout in fact, very high turnout for a special election. And so, with the calendar about to turn to 2026, it's easy to wonder what this election can and can't tell us about the upcoming midterm elections, especially in the U.S. House of Representatives, where Republicans will be protecting a very narrow majority. If you eliminate all the vacancies and give them to the party that held them, it's 220 to 215 in favor of the GOP. So Republicans can't lose more than 2 seats net, or they'll lose the majority. But of course, one special election, it's special. It can't tell us entirely how the 2026 midterms will go, but the result is another clue to understanding the electoral environment as we enter the new year. To help me unpack what happened in Tennessee and what it says or doesn't say about the larger political situation, I'm very excited to welcome in Jacob Rubashkin, the deputy editor of Inside Elections. Jacob knows all the ins and outs, especially about stuff that's happening in the U.S. House. And he is also the co-host of Inside Election Zone podcast. So he really is the ideal person to talk to about Tennessee and 2026 on this fine December day. So Jacob, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. And I grew up a Volunteers fan. So,
oh wow, there you go. Well, there's your orange. Where's your?
Exactly. Good point. No, I had an overzealous math teacher in high school who inculcated all of us for the 3 years we took his class in Tennessee Volunteers fandom. So as everyone else was discovering just this week how two-faced that Lane Kiffin was, those of us who remember our history were well aware of what that man was capable of. So a little Tennessee history, a little Tennessee present, and happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, Rocky Top, right?
Oh, Rocky Top.
Yeah. Cool. Well, hey, to start out with, I thought we'd talk a little bit about the Tennessee outcome, and I was definitely wanting to get your thoughts on, I don't know, what were some of the interesting takeaways for you from a much watched special election result? I think sort of the most watched one we've had so far in the 2025 calendar.
Yeah, I would say it's been a pretty weak slate of special elections relative to some of those races. If you recall back in 2017, for instance, the Georgia 6 special with John Ossoff, the Montana 1 special with Ryan Zinke and Rob Quist, the Pennsylvania special with Connor Lamb, of course. Those were really big ticket items, and none of the specials thus far have generated that level of coverage or interest. But I agree this one was the closest thing we got to it so far. And this was a district that Trump won by 22 points. So just from a top line perspective here, the takeaway is things are not great for Republicans when it cost several $1 million for them to come in and keep a Trump plus 22 district in their column and only by single digits. So am I surprised at the result? No, I think heading into last Tuesday night, my expectation was somewhere in the vicinity of a Van Epps plus 6 or 7 win. He ultimately won by 9. So, roughly in line with expectation, but that expectation baked in the fact that the national environment is pretty bleak for Republicans at this moment.
Yeah, and one of the things that before we got on that we were talking about, and something that I think is kind of telling about this is that if you're talking about a 13-point swing, yes, Democrats have been outperforming their 2024 numbers across the board. In fact, I can even bring that up for our viewers at home. Essentially, so far, on average, and the Texas special election here is a little different, but just for the sake of numbers, uh, the average swing here is 19 points to the left across 6 House special elections. This one saw the smallest swing to the left of any of them, but in some ways it may have been the most watched, and it may have been the one that sort of came closest to replicating at least somewhat a November general election turnout situation, at least if we consider what turnout in Tennessee has looked like in recent midterm elections.
Yeah, so this was, of all of the things that surprised me last night, this was the thing that surprised me the most. That level of turnout that we saw in Tennessee 7. We, at last count, it's roughly 180,000 ballots were cast in this race. And that's basically equivalent to the number of ballots that were cast in this district in the 2022 midterms in Tennessee. So, from a raw number perspective, we essentially saw a midterm level turnout in a special election the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. And that distinguishes this race from all of those other races that we're looking at here, which were much more low key. There was basically no outcome in doubt in the Texas 18, Arizona 7, and Virginia 11 specials. And arguably the Florida specials at the beginning of the year were also outside of one or two, narratives that got rolling close to election day, were never going to be particularly competitive either. This one, sits in a different place when it comes to turnout, and to me, that's just another reason for the Republicans to be a little bit apprehensive about this result, because they can't just chalk it up to Democratic enthusiasm being off the charts and Republicans being depressed because it's the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, because a lot of Republicans showed up to vote. This there was a lot of Republican engagement in this election, and Republicans spent a lot of money turning out their voters. And it was enough to win, but it was not enough to get anywhere close to the margins that they were hitting earlier, in the decade, essentially, in 2024.
Yeah, for people watching or listening, just so they know, I have a table up there right now on screen that lays out a comparison of the total votes in special elections this year, and the total vote in the 2022 midterms in each of those districts as a comparison point. This is not a perfect comparison by any means, especially Tennessee had one of the lowest turnouts actually in the 2022 midterm elections of any
Yeah.
state. So in that sense, it was maybe a little easier for a special election to hit the total that total, but essentially they're equivalent. About 180,000 voted in the special election, and a little over 180,000 voted in the 2022 midterms in the House race into Tennessee's 7th congressional district. And by comparison, the next highest you saw the Florida 6th congressional district back in April, a special election, 65% of the 2022 turnout in that special election. So
And I
definitely different.
Yeah. And I would imagine that Florida 6, from a population growth perspective, that may have something to do with it. That region of Florida is rapidly growing. And so it's not surprising to me that we saw that one kind of come closest to matching the 2022 turnout, because I would wager the population is actually significantly increased, especially relative to some of these other places.
Yeah, exactly. Again, it's an imperfect comparison point, but it is striking to see a special election again right after Thanksgiving, essentially equal a November general election turnout. And
Yeah.
where this was in the comparison point here, there was a Democrat running. He
Yeah.
the Republican Mark Green, who resigned this seat, actually easily won in 2022 and in 2024 in this seat. He resigned, created the vacancy that prompted this special election. But it was not like it was a competitive race by any means. But here you are with a lot of people showing up, and so that actually, I think, raises a point where in the end Van Epps won by about 9 percentage points, and that was a little more than I think. It sounds like maybe slightly more than you anticipated. It was slightly more than I expected, though. Van Epps was definitely favored to win. I thought it was
Yeah.
pretty incredible if from a just like really wow perspective, if Bain had actually pulled off an upset here, uh, given how red the district is. But nonetheless, the fact it is possible that the fact you had turnout look more like a November general election in Tennessee, that actually was one of the reasons Van Epps won by 9 instead of like 6 or
Yeah.
5, was because you got a few more Republicans. There wasn't as much sort of differential turnout. The average Democrat wasn't that much more likely to turn out than the average Republican, which is a thing that we've definitely seen in special elections, especially this year. And also thinking about sort of the makeup of the two parties right now, the voters in the Democratic Party's coalition, there tends to be, on average, college educated voters are somewhat more Democratic leaning, and they're somewhat more likely to turn out. Some lower propensity voters, we saw Donald Trump do better with them in the 2024 presidential election. They're less likely to turn out in the special election. So there are reasons why Democrats would be expected to overperform, including the fact that what's very important right now is that Donald Trump's approval ratings in the low 40s, and there's obviously a bit of a pro-democratic political environment when it comes to elections. But nonetheless, the fact that you actually had a little higher turnout, maybe than we would have expected in a special election here, I think probably was the reason Van Epps won by 9 instead of like
Yeah.
6, because you got
Yeah.
some more Republicans to actually show up.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And if you look at the split between the early vote where Bain did well and the election day vote where Van Epps beat her, that tells the whole story. The Republican money came in the last 2 weeks of the race. After early voting had started, you saw Trump start posting about it on Truth Social. You saw the Speaker of the House get involved. You saw J.D. Vance go down to Fort Campbell, right outside the district. There was a tremendous amount of attention paid at the end of the race here to boost Van Epps. And again, it got him to 9%, right? Which is not what we would expect from this district simply on paper. And yes, special elections are special, but when you put it in the context of all these other races, all the state legislative races that we've seen take place over the last year, and then the regularly scheduled races that we saw in Virginia, New Jersey, California, and all other places around the country, everything is pointing in the same direction, right? You can nitpick the individual outcomes of any individual race, but when you take it in sum, everything is pointing in the same direction, and that direction is voters aren't happy with Republicans right now.
Absolutely. So that maybe that's a good place. I mean, look, we could probably talk till we're blue in the face about the particulars of this election, but I think for viewers and listeners, what's more interesting is sort of what can this potentially tell us or not tell us about the midterms next year. Obviously, as you said, it's sort of a situation where you mentioned that even state legislative special elections have been favorable to Democrats. And then obviously the elections in November. I know the down ballot keeps track of an average of swing in presidential vote from 2024 to what the outcomes have been in a number of elections for U.S. Congress, state legislature, and in some, I forget exactly what the total is, like 50 or something elections at this point. The average swing has been about 13 points in the Democrats' favor, which, oh, by the way, was the swing in Tennessee's 7th. So very fitting, perhaps, to sort of finish off the year more or less with a special that matched the average.
Well, and right, that this was the most, obviously it's not identical to an actual midterm, but if you're devising a test case for a special that looks like a midterm, you have a couple of things going for you. You've got obviously the turnout level, right? We had midterm level turnout in this race. We had midterm level engagement, outside money. Thank you. You're reading my mind here. Both parties engaged in this race. You had Republicans, outside group spending, a constellation of groups, including Trump Super PAC, the Club for Growth, some other GOP groups. You had Democrats' main super PAC, House Majority PAC, get involved as well. You had some Democratic C4 groups, otherwise known as dark money groups, get involved earlier on in the process. So you had both sides engagement, and you had two candidates that realistically could be nominated by their parties for competitive elections in any different corner of the country, right? Matt Van Epps was a former official in the Bill Lee administration. He is a former Army helicopter pilot, West Point grad. Like, you look at him and you say, that guy looks like a Republican member of Congress, right? Afton Bain won a competitive Democratic primary. She's a sitting state legislator. She is more progressive than I think some Democrats wanted to run in this district, but very much of the moment in Democratic politics in a pretty clear way. She's young. She has an organizing background. She really hit the ground game hard. Um, uh, Both of these candidates were real people with real operations, which is different than any other special election that we've had so far this year on the House side, right? The guy running in Florida against Randy Fine was not a real, he had $1 bazillion, but he was not a real candidate. I don't even know who ran against James Walkinshaw in Virginia 11 off the top of my head. Daniel Gutierrez in Arizona 7. I mean, this is the best case that we've had in terms of, can you model what a House election looks like outside of the special election universe? Trying to remove as many of the special election considerations as you can from these quirky races. And so that's why, we get the average. It hit exactly the average at 13. And again, that doesn't mean the Democrats are going to do 13 points better next year than they did in 2024. But it pretty clearly suggests they're going to do something better. And they don't have to do much better to pick up the 3 seats.
Exactly. And for people listening, I've put up a tape or a chart on screen here that Jacob, I think, referred to briefly, which basically I took the FEC the independent expenditure numbers in congressional races from the Federal Election Commission, and calculated out basically the total spent after the primary or nominating process in each of the specials that we've had this year, excluding Texas, which was an all-party election that is kind of weird and not really helpful in this situation. But the point is, about $5.5 million from outside groups was spent in the Tennessee 7th election, and so that's not including candidate spending. And by comparison, the next closest was one of the Florida races in April, Florida's 6th congressional district, the one that Mike Waltz was leaving behind, the Republican there. There was 3.8 million in outside spending, and then none of the other districts has had over $1 million. In fact, the two safe Democratic seats, Virginia's 11th and Arizona's 7th, there was basically no spending. I mean, very minimal outside spending, so much that it doesn't even show up on the graph on the chart because it was so small. So this, to your point, Jacob, I think absolutely came closer to replicating general election conditions. Obviously, it doesn't entirely, but it is certainly closer in those respects. And I guess so. Thinking about that with the 2026 midterms, I was curious if, based on sort of your takeaways from the current political environment, what just happened in November, what we just saw in Tennessee, what do you think at this point is a safe early early thought about what's happening in the 2026 midterms, with obvious caveats that we've got a long time to go. But I figured there's a lot that we could talk about here. So I was curious what came to mind for you.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's safe to have any thoughts this far out, so I'll caveat everything I say afterward with this. I saw a tweet the other day, just this past week, that said, On this day 6 years ago, man reports to hospital in Wuhan, China with cold-like symptoms. And that really took me back.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
talking November 2019. How did we all see the world, let alone the elections? And how did we see things over the next year? I try and approach this kind of time frame at whenever I get to the end of the year. I think back to those moments, and I try to approach this time frame with the utmost humility, because I think it's good to keep our eyes open to the prospect of major events that can shift politics and everything else along with it. So I'll get all those caveats out of the way first here. Clearly, Democrats are on offense and they have the wind at their backs, right? Again, uh, almost all the data that we have available to us, whether it is special election results, the regular election results from this past November, the president's approval rating, which is somewhere between, depending on the average you look at, probably minus 12 and minus 16 or 17. The generic ballot polling that we have, where Democrats have a small but clear edge of, about 4 or 5 points. Um, all of that points to Democratic overperformance relative to last year. The thing that makes it complicated is that we still have probably 100 districts, if not more, where we don't know what the lines will look like. And that makes people like you and me, our jobs almost impossible, because uh, there are seats hanging in the balance that we simply cannot assess because we don't know what they're going to look like. There are things that I'm happy to speculate on. What the Supreme Court will decide in the Texas decision is not one of them, right? And that holds a half dozen seats in the balance there. What goes on in Missouri, what happens in Virginia, what happens in Florida, what happens in Indiana and the state Senate next week. There are all of these fundamental questions that, taken together, probably affect, 100 seats overall, and on the battleground, 20 seats, 15 to 20 seats, and that's a big swing. So, yeah, sure. If the map were taking place under the 2024 map, I think it's very easy to find the 3 seats Democrats need to flip back control, and it's very easy to find a bunch more that they could pick up to pad their majority. That's not going to be the map that we are dealing with. And so you have to incorporate that kind of uncertainty. And that's before you get to looking at the Senate. And that's a whole other beast that is still tough sledding for Democrats. But again, when you're looking at the big picture, it's all about momentum. It's all about directionality. And things seem to be good and getting better for Democrats on a lot of these metrics. And so if your ultimate goal is to draw the inside straight of flipping Maine, North Carolina, and then 2 of Ohio, Iowa, Texas, Alaska, you're much happier when everything's going right than you are if there were flashing warning signs along the way.
No, absolutely. And yeah, obviously the Senate is much tougher for
Yeah.
Democrats because they have to win some seats that are more clear right leaning. In fact, they have to win some seats that are sort of in that range of, if you think about a 13-point swing in the Tennessee race. And if we were
Yeah.
just to go off of that and look at the House, you know, currently, and again, to your point, the lines are going to shift some, but there's like 40 some odd Republican seats that are to the left of R plus 13 on the 2024 presidential number.
Yeah.
So held by Republicans. Again, things are going to shift some because of redistricting. Things will change further. Uh, what have you. But that's a large group. So if Democrats can find themselves in a position where they're making a play for like uh, Montana's first district or something in the western part of the state, which is a seat that Donald Trump carried by a little less than 12 percentage points in 2024, as just an example of like sort of
Yeah.
an edge case seat that Democrats might have hopes of chasing. They'd be underdogs, but if we're sort of thinking about the possibilities here for them, that's a seat that they're going to want to target
Yeah.
and hope that a wave catches enough that they can flip it. the problem is for Democrats is that a lot of the states that they need to win in the Senate, of course, are much like that Montana seat. A seat that I don't know what Trump won Ohio by around 10,
Yeah.
11. I mean, these are the kinds of seats in Iowa, like these low double digit seats. Uh, you're talking about the inside straight draw. It's like they have an open ended straight draw for the House,
Yeah.
and very much an inside straight draw for the Senate. But nonetheless, they do have opportunities, and again, we don't know where the environment will go from here. But I thought that might be helpful, is just for people understanding if Democrats only need 3 seats and they have a lot of seats potentially to
Yeah.
target. Republicans will have some too, thanks to redistricting in part. But the Senate is definitely a much higher hurdle.
Yeah. But if you're Democrats, you look at that 13 point on average shift and you look at some of the things that are going right for you in some of these states. Again, I don't think we've had a day since November, since the first Tuesday in November, where Democrats have gone to bed less confident than they were when they woke up.
Yeah, I mean that makes perfect sense. And uh, you know, the thing that I constantly, and I think this is probably a good time to bring this up. I had this chart ready, just from like a thinking about things generally, again, because we don't know, and every election is different, and the world universe of seats that could be competitive in the House is smaller perhaps now than it has been in the past, because things are more polarized, also with the redistricting stuff going on, more seats that are supposed to be sort of safe for one party. You're getting some competitive seats taken out in that process. I talked about that recently on the podcast with Nathaniel Rakich.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, if President Trump's approval rating is in the low 40s, I made this actually back, this chart that's on screen right now, back in August, I think, or July. It's been a while.
Mm.
And at the time, Trump's approval was around 45%. Now it's closer to like 42. I mean, again, it depends on the average, but that was at the time was historically in line with about a 30-seat loss in the House. And now that number bounces around a lot. You're fitting a small number of points to get to that result, but it does, I think, shine a light on seeing the November election results and the swing that Democrats enjoyed. Even though it was some blue states, you can't discount that Democrats were kind of winning across the board, including in a lot of 50-50 places.
Yeah.
And knowing that, and then applying that, and knowing that Donald Trump's approval rating is in the low 40s, and who knows what's going to happen in the next, 12 months, 11 months, but nonetheless, based on his first term, I don't know if there's a great chance of it improving markedly
Yeah.
from where it's been, because he obviously is a very divisive figure, polarizing figure. People have very strong opinions about him one way or the other. It seems to me that that's kind of a fundamental problem here. And
Yeah.
I actually wanted, this was all kind of leading up to a question for you, which so I apologize for the long lead up. Thinking about Donald Trump and thinking about approval rating and thinking about sort of president's party, one thing that I've been wondering about, and I think the Tennessee election really raises this question, because we saw Republicans run a lot of ads without mentioning Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And so they're trying to sort of separate themselves. I was curious for your thoughts about Trump as, if not lame duck, someone that suddenly not every Republican candidate is running every ad saying, "Hey, I'm with Donald Trump," in a way that we haven't seen in recent times.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, this is a great chart. This is a wonderful graph that immediately catches my eye. I understood, but didn't really, seeing it on paper affecting how much of an outlier Obama in 2010 was. That 45% approval, and yet losing more seats than any other president.
Had a lot to
That
do with Democrats holding a lot of Republican-leaning seats.
Yeah.
Came back to bite
Yeah.
them very hard.
What a striking outlier there. But to your larger point, um, it absolutely is unfamiliar territory for Republicans to have to deal with a president that is so wounded politically as Trump is at this point in his political career. Um, Obviously they dealt with this a little bit in 2018, but honestly, in 2018, I think that they had more license to break from him than they did now because he was still pretty fresh on the scene. He did not have the ironclad control over both the party apparatus and the voter base that he has enjoyed since 2020, arguably. Um, I did think it was incredibly notable that Van Epps was not running ads with him shaking hands with Trump, all day, every day. That the Republican ads were not focused on Trump. They weren't focused on the big, beautiful bill, which is something that we hear Republican strategists talk about all the time, how the way they're going to keep the House is by running ads about the big, beautiful bill and how popular its elements are, like no tax on tips and the no tax on Social Security and things like that. There was none of that in Matt Van Epps' advertising either. So yeah, I think Republicans are going to have to uh, kind of chart a new path here, and nobody really knows what that's going to look like, especially because while Trump is diminished, he certainly hasn't left the scene. We've seen that he has still tremendous political capital, financial capital at his disposal. He's laying a lot of that to bear on the Indiana Republicans right now, and those state senators are dealing with the pressures that come with separating from Trump on even one kind of esoteric issue, right? Which is mid-decade redistricting. This is not something that is like the hottest button issue of the last 20 years or something. This is a process question that has become a catalyst for nationwide campaigning, death threats, constant attention, primary threats looking to 2026 and 2028. So there's still a lot of juice left in Trump's tank, even if it is pretty depleted relative to where he was, for instance, a year ago or in 2020. So I don't know how Republicans are going to handle it because his endorsement is still golden in a primary. Um, his sway is such that someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene lasted all of a week breaking from the president publicly on an issue where she had overwhelming support from the base, right? It's not as if the Republican base liked how Trump was handling the Epstein files, approved of keeping them under wraps. I think voters by and large were on her side. And yet the mere act of breaking with Trump on that and on some of these other issues surrounding the shutdown was enough to push her out of Congress. So I don't know. I think it's going to be a really delicate dance for Republicans. And I think that if the president is still at 42% approval or even lower, there was a Gallup poll out the other day that had him as low as 36%. They're going to have to get real creative, and they're going to have to hope that that happens before the primaries instead of after, because the way to get through these primaries is still to be the Trumpiest candidate.
Yeah, and this is where exactly what the actual House battlefield looks like is going to be important, because if we're talking about this being more of a thing in a Republican primary in a seat that has been drawn to be heavily Republican in, say, Indiana, where the 9 seats there currently, Republicans hold 7 of 9. But they are the map, if it were to pass, that they are looking at, and they could also change that map. But currently, the proposal that has been making the rounds would essentially make the first district, which is held by Frank Mervyn, a I think it was Trump plus 12 district, and then the rest of the map goes about carving up Indianapolis and the 7th district, currently held by Democrat Andre Carson, into like I could think across 4 districts, and all of them are basically like Trump plus 18 or better in 2024. So very, very hard for a Democrat to actually win those seats. So if it's a Republican primary, obviously Donald Trump's position and who he's endorsing is big. I mean, he endorsed Van Epps in the Republican primary for this special election, for instance, and Van Epps, went on to win with a little bit more than 50% in the GOP primary. But in some of these seats that are a little more competitive, or even potentially a little bit more competitive, it does raised some interesting prospects about how Republicans may want to go about campaigning. Something that did cross my mind as we were talking about this is that, maybe it's a little tangential, but I think it could be a little telling, which is Elise Stefanik, who is obviously a very notable member of the U.S. House of Representatives and is running for governor of New York, and is probably going to be the Republican nominee for governor. We'll see. There's good reason to think that she will be. Obviously, New York is not an easy state to win as a Republican, but I did think it was really interesting that she has sort of declared, war on Speaker Mike Johnson in the last day or two, in a really public way. And so I was like, when I was thinking about how you try to differentiate yourself, is by trying to attack Republican leadership in the House as a way of avoiding attacking Trump, because Stefanik is never going to separate herself from Trump. She has very much committed herself to being close to Donald Trump. So I didn't know if you had any thoughts about that. It struck me as an interesting development in sort of internal Republican politics.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why she made the decision to go after Johnson in such a public manner. I'm not convinced necessarily that this is a triangulation on her
Mm.
part ahead of the governor's race. I'm not sure that it matters to New York voters whether she likes or dislikes Mike Johnson. I'm not sure how many voters in New York State could pick Mike Johnson out of a lineup. So, uh, I don't know why she has chosen the path that she has over the last couple days, but I guess I'm not yet convinced that that is a play to make herself look a little more moderate or get around having to deal with Trump in a state that Trump lost by 11 points. But one thing I will say that I think is interesting, and to the extent that there is silver linings for Republicans in the House fight so far, is that the White House has been very successful in keeping Republican incumbents in tough districts in place. And with only three exceptions, they have managed to keep all of their battleground incumbents running for reelection. Now, they weren't able to stop Don Bacon from retiring, and Bacon is probably at this point the most vocal critic of Trump from kind of the middle in the Republican caucus, setting aside, Thomas Massey or Rand Paul. John James, who I think they did try and stop from running statewide. And from what I understand, the reason why John James's launch for governor was so rushed was because he wanted to get ahead of whatever the White House was planning to keep him running for the House.
Beat the pressure campaign. Get out in front of it.
Literally, and even then, I'll note John James kept $500,000 in his House campaign account just in case. I don't know. And then, of course, David Schweikert, who I think is running for governor or is retiring by way of running for governor in a primary that he is almost
For the
sure.
other two candidates are have Trump's endorsement. Yeah.
Exactly. And that can go either way. Either you look at it and you say Trump's already endorsed two candidates, he's not going to endorse anyone else. Or you can say normally he only endorses one, now he's endorsed two, so maybe he'll endorse three. Who's to say? Um, but other than that, I mean, you take a guy like Zach Nunn in Iowa 3, the Des Moines district that is on the battlefield, and this is a guy who wanted to run for governor, got shot down, wanted to run for Senate in the open seat after Joni Ernst announced she wouldn't run for reelection, got shot down, floated another gubernatorial bid, got shot down, then floated moving districts to the 4th district, which is open as a much more Republican district. That got shot down as well. You have Mike Lawler in New York 17, wanted to run for governor. He got shot down. Trump went with Stefanik instead. And I think obviously incumbents are stronger generally, and the White House wants to keep Republican incumbents in those competitive races. But I think a byproduct of that is it's easier ultimately for an incumbent to create a little bit of distance from Trump if they are reading the writing on the wall than it is for primary candidates to do so. If you're locked in a Republican primary that isn't going to be resolved until a couple months before election day, you can't create any distance between yourself and Trump. until you get the nomination. And so, um, I don't know if that's why part of the White House's calculation here, but I think it is beneficial for Republicans that in most of these competitive districts, they don't have to worry about primaries dragging their candidates toward Trump. Now, all of their candidates, by virtue of being members of Congress, are already pretty closely attached to the president, but they have a little bit more flexibility than if they were required every day to prove for their political life that they were the Trumpiest candidate of the bunch.
Right. And most of those incumbents will not have much primary competition.
Yeah.
So they won't have to, be running ads, attaching themselves to the president constantly
No.
ahead of the election until you get closer to the election. And then they may try other forms of messaging. And obviously, someone like Mike Lawler in a swing seat already has quite a bit of practice at that. So it has shown perhaps evidence of being able to run ahead of the Republican ticket and sort of the Republican baseline in his seat. And so I do think, and it actually reminds me a little bit of some Democrats in 2024, thinking about the fact that, Donald Trump won the national popular vote by about 1.5 points. Republicans won a narrow 220 to 215 majority. And I do think Democrats were aided in the House, the U.S. House specifically. Democrats got close to having a shot at a majority, in part because they held on to a bunch of seats with narrow margins. And this was also somewhat in 2022 as well. And some of that was helped out by particular candidate strengths, in some cases incumbents, in some cases weaker opponents. So if you keep more strong incumbents in place, if you're the Republicans, maybe you're giving yourself, you're improving your chances marginally enough in a lot of seats where it could add up and get them closer to holding on to things.
Yeah.
Well, hey, Jacob, I think, we've been talking for a little bit here, and I think this has been very illuminating on kind of trying to place the Tennessee election in context with the larger House picture as we look ahead to 2026. Still a million unknowns, as we have, I think, hopefully made clear to people listening and watching at home. But I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking about all this with me. Again, it's Jacob Rubashkin, the deputy editor at Inside Elections. You can check out his work there. Inside Elections does great work. It's one of the sort of the premier ratings outlets. So if you're curious which way a race might be leaning or tilting, you can go there and check it out. And I'm Jeffrey Skelly. I'm the chief elections analyst here at Decision Desk, and we will have plenty more where this came from in the months to come. So again, Jacob, thanks for joining me.
Of course, this was fun.